to it. So as I said in the last video, industrialism describes the change in the way things are made for sale, specifically the move toward mass production and mass consumption of goods. And generally, historians call this period of American history the Gilded Age. Now, if something is gilded, that just means it's covered with gold. But to say something is gilded tells you nothing about what's underneath the gold. In my estimation, the Gilded Age was something akin to a gold-covered turd. And in this video, we're going to talk about the gold, and in the next video, we're going to talk about the turd underneath the gold. So during the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, small locally owned businesses basically became obsolete and defunct due to the rise of large corporations and trusts that eventually came to dominate entire industries, especially the railroad, steel, and oil industries. Now, I talked a good deal about railroads in the last video, so here just let me focus on oil and steel. In the oil industry, the name you need to know is John D. Rockefeller, and he was the owner of Standard Oil. And as the company grew, he made many shrewd business moves that forced his competitors to sell their companies to him, thus eliminating the competition. By the late 1880s, Standard Oil controlled almost 90% of the oil industry. Now, this particular practice of consolidation was called horizontal integration, and by definition, this just means that one company eventually buys out all of its competitors until there is effectively no competition left. In the steel industry, the name you need to know is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, like Rockefeller, was a shrewd businessman and grew his company to the point where it dominated the steel industry, except Carnegie didn't consolidate his interests through horizontal integration. He was more of the vertical integration persuasion. Vertical integration is when a company acquires all the complementary industries that support its business. For example, over time, Carnegie was able to buy up companies that handled all parts of steel production, from mining companies to processing companies to distribution companies. Again, that means complete domination of the industry with little room for competition. Now, both of these men and the others who followed similar practices grew fabulously wealthy during this period, and there were several reasons why they were able to get away with these kinds of practices. The first reason was the proliferation of laissez-faire government policies. As I've mentioned before, laissez-faire, when being translated, means something like let alone. And so politicians during this time had an almost allergic reaction to any government intervention or regulation over these business practices. And it could be that these politicians really believed that government regulation was harmful to the noble principles of free enterprise. Or maybe it was that guys like John D. Rockefeller kept stuffing buttloads of money in their pockets to keep them from passing regulations. You know, potato, potato. The second reason these men were able to grow so wealthy is because they relied heavily on a large pool of underpaid laborers like immigrants, women, and children. I mentioned in a previous video that during this period there was a huge influx of immigrants from Europe, and while some of them settled in the West, the vast majority of them streamed into urban industrial centers looking for work. They were vastly underpaid, and again, there was no governmental regulation on wages, and they weren't able to ask for higher wages because if they did, there were 10 other immigrants looking for jobs who would work at the lower wage. Additionally, factory owners realized that in this age of unskilled labor, they could employ women and children to work the machines as well. And the third reason these kinds of business practices were tolerated was because of the application of social Darwinism to economics. Now, in case you forgot, social Darwinism was sort of a corruption of biological Darwinism. In nature, the strong eat the weak, and it's all survival of the fittest. And then social Darwinists came and argued that if that's how nature works, then why not apply that to society? Strong nations should eat weak nations, and in this case, strong companies should eat weak companies, as is the way of nature. And in that way, these folks argued, the world's wealth would be concentrated into the hands of those who were deemed the most fit.